The handcuffs were halfway on when she smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a defeated smile. The kind of smile that makes a predator realize they've been hunting the wrong prey. Judge Marcus Hull had just made the biggest mistake of his 30-year career. He assumed the terrified girl in front of him was exactly what she looked like. A broke law student. Powerless. Desperate. Clueless. But Tanya had spent 6 years waiting for this exact moment. And when she opened her mouth to speak, she didn't cite traffic law. She cited the one statute that judges pray defendants never discover. The one that strips judicial immunity in real time. The one that turns a courtroom into a crime scene. Hull's face went from crimson rage to ash-white terror in less than 3 seconds. Because he finally understood. She didn't stumble into his courtroom by accident. She had hunted him. And now, with a gallery full of witnesses and a camera rolling in the back, his entire empire was about to collapse from 5 words she whispered across the bench. Your Honor, you're under arrest. This is the story of how one law student with $43 in her bank account brought down a judge so corrupt, so protected, so untouchable, that attorneys in 3 counties refused to practice in his courtroom. They called Judge Marcus Hull the executioner. Not because he followed the law, but because he was the law. At least that's what he believed. But Hull made one fatal error. He thought arrogance was armor. He thought the bench made him invincible. And when a young woman named Tanya walked into courtroom 4B on a Tuesday morning in November, he thought she'd be just another victim he could humiliate, break, and forget. What Judge Hull didn't know was that Tanya wasn't there to fight a traffic ticket. She was there to end his career. She'd been planning this moment since she was 17 years old, since the day Hull destroyed someone she loved. And she'd spent every single day since then preparing for the moment she could look him in the eye and make him feel what real justice looks like. This isn't just a courtroom drama. This is a masterclass in patience, precision, and the power of knowing exactly when to strike. Because sometimes, justice doesn't knock. It walks in quietly, waits for you to dig your own grave, and then buries you in it. This is the silent statute. Let's go back to where it all began. To the moment Tanya walked through those mahogany doors and into the lion's den. The air in courtroom 4B tasted like fear and furniture polish. Tanya noticed it the moment she pushed through the heavy mahogany doors. That particular blend of recycled anxiety and institutional power that clung to the wood paneling like a stain. The gallery was fuller than she'd expected for a Tuesday morning. At least 40 people crammed into pews designed for 30, all of them wearing the same expression. Eyes down, shoulders curved inward, the universal posture of prey, hoping the predator wouldn't notice them. She understood why when she saw him. Judge Marcus Hull sat behind the bench like a king on a throne. His black robe somehow blacker than anyone else's. His silver hair swept back in a way that screamed, I'm more important than your problems. He had the kind of face that probably looked distinguished in campaign photos. Strong jaw, piercing blue eyes, a neatly trimmed goatee gone white with age. But in person, there was something reptilian about him. The way his eyes tracked movement. The way his mouth curled when someone stuttered. Tanya slipped into the back row and watched him work. Mr. Hendricks? Hull's voice boomed across the courtroom, and a middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit jacket jumped like he'd been electrocuted. Did you seriously just attempt to explain traffic law to me? To me? Do you see this? He gestured to his robes with mock grandiosity. This means I've forgotten more about the law than you will ever know. Which, given your performance today, isn't saying much. Scattered, nervous laughter rippled through the gallery. The kind of laughter that's really just relief that you're not the target. Yet, Hendricks mumbled an apology, his face the color of brick. Hull waved him away like he was dismissing a servant, already moving on to his next victim before Hendricks even made it back to his seat. A young mother with a baby on her hip approached next. Her citation was for an expired registration, 37 days overdue. She explained, voice shaking, that her husband had been hospitalized, that she'd been living at the ICU, that she'd genuinely forgotten. Hull's smile was surgical, precise, cruel. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm going to tell you what I tell everyone who stands before me with their hand out and their excuses ready. I am not your therapist. I am not your social worker. I am certainly not your friend." He leaned forward, and even from the back row, Tanya could see the woman flinch. "You broke the law. You got caught. You pay. That's how civilization works. $500. Next." The baby started crying. Mrs. Patterson fumbled with her purse, tears streaming down her face as she tried to quiet the infant while simultaneously digging for a credit card she probably didn't have. Nobody helped her. Nobody looked at her. They were all too busy being grateful it wasn't them. Tanya watched it all with the kind of stillness that looks like calm but is actually tightly wound focus. She'd studied Hull for years, read every case file, every appeal, every sealed complaint that had mysteriously disappeared from public record. She knew his patterns, the way he ramped up his cruelty as the morning wore on, the way he saved his worst venom for people he perceived as weak or stupid, the way he particularly enjoyed humiliating anyone who dared to think they were smart. Law students, for instance. She'd counted on it. "Tanya Morrison," the bailiff called, and she rose smoothly, her navy blue blazer perfectly pressed. Her dark hair pulled back in a way that looked professional but not threatening. She carried a single folder, thin, unremarkable, and walked to the podium with measured steps. Hull glanced at his docket, then at her, then back at the paper. His eyebrows lifted slightly, and Tanya recognized the exact moment his decision was made. She could see it in the way his posture shifted, the way his fingers drummed once on the bench. He'd just decided she was going to be his entertainment for the morning. "Ms. Morrison," he said, dragging out her name like he was tasting it. "Law student, I see. Second year." He said it the way someone might say cockroach or parking ticket. "Third year, Your Honor." "Ah, so you've had just enough education to be dangerous but not enough to be useful." He smiled at his own joke. A few people in the gallery laughed on cue. "You're here regarding a citation for, let's see, failure to yield at a marked intersection. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. There's actually a procedural." "Stop." His hand went up like he was stopping traffic. "Did I ask you to speak? Did I give you permission to explain anything? Or did you just assume that because you've read a few textbooks, you're qualified to educate me on procedure?" Tanya said nothing. Her face remained perfectly neutral. Hull leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself now. The entire courtroom had gone silent. This was the show they'd been waiting for, the moment when the executioner chose his next victim. "You know what I think, Ms. Morrison? I think you walked in here with your little folder and your perfect posture, thinking you were going to dazzle me with your legal expertise. I think you thought you were special." His voice dropped to something soft and venomous. "You're not." Tanya met his eyes and held them, and that's when Hull made his fatal mistake. "I'm going to teach you a lesson about respect," he said, his smile widening. "Consider this your real legal education." Hull gestured toward the podium with the kind of magnanimous flourish that made it clear he was granting her a privilege, not a right. "Please, Ms. Morrison, enlighten us. What procedural matter could possibly be so important that it justifies interrupting me?" Tanya opened her folder with deliberate calm. "Your Honor, the citation lists the intersection as Maple and 5th, but the actual location was Maple and 4th. The officer noted the wrong." "Are you accusing a sworn police officer of lying?" The question came like a whip crack. Tanya had barely finished her sentence. "No, Your Honor. I'm simply stating that there's a factual error in the—" "You're simply stating." Hull repeated her words slowly, letting them hang in the air like an accusation. "You're simply stating that this officer, who has served this community for 15 years, who risks his life every day, somehow can't tell the difference between 4th Street and 5th Street. Is that your legal theory, counselor?" He said the last word with dripping sarcasm. Your Honor, I'm not questioning the officer's integrity. I'm pointing out a clerical mistake a mistake. Hull leaned forward now, his eyes narrowing. So first you're not accusing him of lying, but now it's a mistake. Which is it, Ms. Morrison? Is he incompetent or dishonest? Because you seem to be arguing both. Tanya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the first crack in her composure, and Hull saw it. His smile deepened. Your Honor, I'm simply requesting that the court review the dash cam footage, which clearly shows. Objection. Hull's hand slammed down on the bench, and half the courtroom jumped. Oh wait, I'm sorry. This isn't a trial. There is no opposing counsel. Which means when you stand there and make dramatic speeches about evidence and footage, you're not doing legal work. You're performing. You're grandstanding. The word hung in the air like a verdict. Tanya said nothing. She'd learned from watching the others. Speaking only gave him more ammunition. So she stood there, folder still open, and waited. Hull stood up from his chair, which he almost never did. The black robes made him look larger somehow, like a thundercloud taking shape. Do you know what I see when I look at you, Ms. Morrison? I see every arrogant law student who's ever walked into my courtroom thinking they're the smartest person in the room. Thinking that because they can cite a statute or motion for dismissal, they've earned the right to waste my time. He started pacing behind the bench, warming to his theme now. The gallery was transfixed. You know what grandstanding is, legally speaking? It's when an attorney makes statements designed not to serve their client, but to serve their own ego, to show off, to make themselves look clever. He stopped pacing and pointed directly at her. And what you just did, accusing an officer of incompetence, demanding I review footage like you're directing a murder trial over a simple traffic citation. That's textbook grandstanding. And in my courtroom, that's contempt. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Contempt wasn't a fine. Contempt meant jail. Your Honor. Tanya's voice was steady, but quieter now. I apologize if my approach was inappropriate. I'm simply trying to present factual evidence that you're doing it again. Hull's voice rose to something close to a shout. Right now, this moment, you're standing in my courtroom after I've just explained to you what you did wrong, and you're arguing with me. You're telling me I'm mistaken. Do you see what's happening here? Do you understand that you are, in real time, committing the exact offense I just described? Tanya closed her folder slowly. The courtroom was so quiet that the soft rustle of paper sounded like breaking glass. I'm not arguing with you, Your Honor. No. Hull's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. Then what would you call it? I'm exercising my right to present a defense. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Someone in the back row audibly gasped. Even the court reporter looked up from her steno machine, eyes wide. Hull's face went from theatrical anger to something colder. More dangerous. Real. You're right. He said it slowly, tasting each word. Ms. Morrison, let me educate you about rights. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. But you do not have the right to disrespect this court. You do not have the right to waste my time with conspiracy theories about street corners. And you certainly do not have the right to lecture me about legal procedure in front of a gallery full of witnesses. He sat back down, adjusting his robes with theatrical precision. When he spoke again, his voice was almost conversational. I find you in contempt of court. 30 days in county jail. Sentence to begin immediately. He glanced at the bailiff, a thick-necked man named Morrison who looked like he'd been carved from a fireplug. Officer Morrison, take her into custody. The bailiff's hand moved toward his handcuffs, uncertainty flickering across his face. This wasn't standard. Everyone in the courtroom knew it. 30 days for questioning a citation? But Hull was already moving on, making a show of reviewing his next file, like Tanya had already ceased to exist. That's when he heard it. Not a sob, not a plea, something worse. A low, quiet laugh. Hull's head snapped up. Tanya was smiling. Not the nervous smile of someone about to be arrested. The patient smile of someone who just watched their opponent walk exactly where they wanted them to go. Something funny, Ms. Morrison? Tanya looked directly at him, and for the first time since she'd entered his courtroom, Hull felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Doubt. No, Your Honor, she said softly. I'm just wondering, do you want me to stay silent now? Or would you prefer I exercise my right to make a final statement for the record? Hull's instinct screamed at him to say no, to have her dragged out immediately, to end this before, but his ego was louder than his instinct. By all means, he said with a dismissive wave. Give us your final performance. Bailey Officer Morrison's hand was already on his cuffs when Hull held up a finger, stopping him mid-reach. The judge wasn't done yet. Not even close. Actually, wait. Hull settled back into his chair with the satisfied air of a cat that had just cornered a mouse. Before we proceed, I want to make sure Ms. Morrison fully understands the gravity of what's about to happen to her. The bailiff stepped back, uncertain but obedient. His hand hovered near the cuffs on his belt. Hull steepled his fingers beneath his chin, the picture of judicial contemplation. You see, contempt of court isn't just a charge, Ms. Morrison. It's a conviction. It goes on your permanent record. And not just any record, your legal record. The one the state bar examines before they allow you to practice law. Tanya stood motionless at the podium, her folder now closed, her hands resting lightly on its surface. She said nothing. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Hull continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor explaining something to a particularly slow student. You won't be taking the bar exam. Not now. Probably not ever. Because before you can even sit for the exam, you have to prove moral character. And moral character does not include contempt convictions. A woman in the second row, someone waiting for her own case, covered her mouth with her hand. The young mother with the baby had stopped crying and was just staring, horrified, at the scene unfolding. Hull was warming up now, feeding off the audience's reaction. Your law school will be notified, of course. Academic standards, you understand. Most institutions have policies about students with criminal records, especially criminal records involving disrespect for the judicial system. He paused for effect. I imagine they'll start expulsion proceedings within the week. Your Honor, someone started from the gallery, an older man in a cheap suit who looked like a public defender. Quiet. Hull didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Tanya, drinking in what he assumed was her silent despair. This isn't your concern, counselor. Unless you'd like to join Ms. Morrison in learning about the consequences of disrespect. The man sat back down. Hull stood again, this time walking around the bench to stand at its edge, closer to Tanya. It was a power move, leaving the elevated position to tower over her at ground level. To make it personal. Let me paint you a picture of your immediate future, he said, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. Cruel intimacy. Officer Morrison is going to place you in handcuffs. You're going to be escorted out of this courtroom in front of all these people. You'll be processed at county intake, fingerprints, mugshot, the works. They'll give you an orange jumpsuit that won't fit and shoes that smell like everyone who's worn them before you. Tanya's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked calmer than she had moments before. You'll spend tonight in a holding cell with women who've actually committed crimes, Hull continued. And then tomorrow you'll appear before a different judge, one who won't be nearly as patient as I am, and you'll try to explain why you thought you could waltz into my courtroom and disrespect the law. He started pacing now, playing to the room. But here's the truly beautiful part, Ms. Morrison. Here's the lesson you're about to learn that they don't teach in evidence class or constitutional law. You can have all the book knowledge in the world. You can memorize every statute, every precedent, every footnote in every casebook. But if you don't have respect, if you don't understand that the law isn't some abstract concept you debate in seminars, then you don't have anything. Someone's phone buzzed in the gallery. Hull shot a glare in that direction, and the person frantically silenced it. Your professors probably told you that you were special, Hull said, turning back to Tanya. That you were smart. That you were going to change the world. They filled your head with idealistic nonsense about justice and fairness and speaking truth to power. His laugh was sharp and ugly. This is the truth, Ms. Morrison. This, right here. Power isn't something you speak to. It's something you respect. And you don't. The bailiff shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. This had gone well beyond standard procedure, even for Hull. Look at you, Hull said, stepping even closer. Standing there with your cheap blazer and your office supply store folder, thinking you were going to outsmart me. Do you know how many law students I've crushed? Actual attorneys with actual law degrees who thought they could challenge me. He held up his hand, making a zero with his fingers. None of them practice in this county anymore. Not one. He turned to address the entire courtroom now, his voice rising. Let this be a lesson to everyone here. The law is not a democracy. It is not a debate club. When you stand in my courtroom, you stand before the embodiment of legal authority. And if you challenge that authority, if you disrespect it, you will be destroyed. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the baby had stopped fussing. Hull turned back to Tanya, his smile returning. Any last words, counselor? Any more legal theories you'd like to share? Perhaps a stirring speech about injustice. The mockery in his voice was thick enough to choke on. Tanya tilted her head slightly, studying him like he was a specimen under glass. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear enough to carry to every corner of the room. Just one question, Your Honor. Before Officer Morrison takes me into custody? She glanced at the bailiff, then back at Hull. Would you like me to state my objection for the record? Or would you prefer to proceed without knowing exactly which law you're currently violating? Hull's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Then it returned harder than before. Oh, this should be entertaining. He gestured broadly, mockingly. Please, the floor is yours. Tell us all which law I'm violating. Show us how clueless you really are. He actually laughed. A full, genuine laugh that echoed off the wood paneling. That's when Tanya opened her folder again, and Hull stopped laughing. The folder was thicker than it had looked. That was the first thing Hull noticed. What had seemed like a single sheet of paper was actually multiple documents, organized with colored tabs, the kind of meticulous preparation that spoke of hours, maybe weeks of work. Tanya pulled out a single page and set it on the podium, leaving the rest of the folder closed. Her movements were precise, unhurried. When she looked up, something in her eyes had changed. The nervousness was gone. The deference was gone. What remained was something cold and surgical. Your Honor, she said, and her voice had changed too. Lower, steadier. The voice of someone who'd stopped playing defense. Before Officer Morrison executes your order, I'm formally requesting to make a statement of fact for the record. Not an argument, not a defense, just facts. Pursuant to State Code Section 38.2a, I have the right to place factual information into the official court record before any custodial sentence is imposed. Hull's smile widened. He didn't know what game she was playing, but he was enjoying it. Section 38.2a? Did you just cite a statute at me after I told you that citing statutes was grandstanding? I'm not citing it to argue, Your Honor. I'm citing it to invoke a right. There's a difference. Is there? Hull laughed again, but this time it sounded slightly forced. Fine. Yes. Make your statement. Put your facts on the record. I'm sure it will be fascinating. He glanced at the court reporter. Janet, make sure you get every word of this. I want it preserved for posterity. For the appeals course textbooks on how not to practice law. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the gallery. Tanya reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small recording device, the kind lawyers use for dictation. She set it on the podium next to her papers, then pressed a button. A tiny red light began blinking. Hull's smile flickered. "What do you think you're doing?" "Creating a contemporaneous record of my statement, Your Honor. It's permitted under courtroom policy for self-represented parties." I checked. She said it flatly, without inflection. A statement of fact, nothing more. For the first time, Hull looked uncertain. "You came prepared to record yourself?" "I came prepared for several contingencies." Tanya's hands were perfectly still on the podium now. No fidgeting, no nervous energy. "Shall I proceed with my statement?" Hull waved dismissively, but his posture had shifted. He was sitting straighter now, more alert. "Get on with it." Tanya picked up the page she'd placed on the podium. But she didn't read from it. Instead, she looked directly at Hull, and when she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the courtroom with the kind of clarity that comes from extensive practice. "For the record, my name is Tanya Marie Morrison, third-year law student at State University College of Law, ID number 2027187. Today's date is November 14th. The time is approximately 10:47 a.m. I am currently standing in Courtroom 4B of the Municipal District Court, presided over by Judge Marcus Hull." She paused, and the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "I state for the record that I entered this courtroom at 9:15 a.m. this morning to address Municipal Citation Number 2024 T-8847, issued on October 22nd for an alleged failure to yield. I state for the record that at no point during this proceeding have I raised my voice, used profane language, physically threatened anyone, or engaged in behavior that would constitute actual contempt of court under any objective legal standard." Hull leaned forward. "Ms. Morrison, I'm not finished." The words came out sharp as a scalpel. Not loud, not aggressive, just absolute. Hull's mouth snapped shut in shock. No one had cut him off mid-sentence in his own courtroom in 15 years. Tanya continued without missing a beat, her eyes never leaving Hull's face. "I state for the record that Judge Hull found me in contempt not for any behavior that meets the legal definition of contempt, but because I attempted to present evidence of a factual error in my citation. I state for the record that Judge Hull has threatened me with a 30-day jail sentence, expulsion from law school, and the destruction of my legal career." Her voice was getting quieter, but somehow more forceful. Everyone in the courtroom was leaning forward to hear. "I further state for the record that this is not the first time Judge Marcus Hull has weaponized contempt charges against someone he perceived as powerless. It's not even the 10th time." She flipped the page, revealing a list. On March 3, 2019, he held attorney David Chun in contempt for citing procedure. On July 12, 2020, he held public defender Sarah Martinez in contempt for requesting a recess. On January 8, 2023, he held. "That's enough." Hull's voice was sharp now, the amusement completely gone. Tanya looked up from her list. "I have 16 more names, Your Honor. Would you like me to continue?" The courtroom was frozen. The court reporter had stopped typing. The bailiff's hand had moved away from his cuffs. Even the people in the gallery who'd been looking down were now staring, transfixed. Hull stood up slowly, his face darkening from theatrical anger into something genuine. "I said that's enough. You don't get to stand in my courtroom and—" "Your courtroom." Tanya set down her list and picked up another document from her folder. "Let's talk about that phrase for a moment, because I need to place one more fact on the record before we proceed. A fact about whose courtroom this actually is." She held up the document so the gallery could see it, though they were too far away to read it. But Hull could see it, and the way the blood drained from his face told everyone in the room that whatever was written on that paper, it was exactly what Tanya needed it to be. "Judge Hull, do you recognize this signature?" Her voice was ice now, professional ice, prosecutorial ice. Hull said nothing. "Let me help you, Your Honor. It's yours." From a contract dated April 2019. Would you like me to read it into the record? Or would you like to tell everyone here what it says? Hull's hand moved toward his gavel, but he didn't pick it up. His fingers just hovered there, trembling slightly. Ms. Morrison, I'm warning you. State Code, Title 12, Section 455.3, Subsection D. Tanya's voice cut through his warning like it wasn't even there. Immediate judicial recusal for undisclosed financial interest. I'm formally invoking it. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Even the other attorneys waiting for their cases sat up straighter. Section 455.3 D wasn't something people cited. It wasn't something most lawyers even knew existed. It was one of those ancient statutes, written in the 1890s during a corruption scandal, that had been buried under a century of legal precedent and largely forgotten. But it had never been repealed. Hull's face had gone from red to gray. That statute is archaic. It hasn't been used in 87 years, Tanya finished. The last invocation was in 1938, State versus Kensington. But it's never been overturned, superseded, or invalidated, which means it's still active law. And Your Honor, I believe you know exactly why I'm citing it right now. She set down the contract and picked up another document, this one with an official seal visible even from a distance. Section 455.3 D states that any judge who maintains a direct or indirect financial relationship with a party materially connected to cases before their bench must immediately recuse themselves upon discovery. Failure to do so doesn't just create grounds for appeal. It strips the judge of qualified immunity for any actions taken after the conflict is revealed. There is no conflict, Hull said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. He sounded defensive now, almost panicked. No. Tanya's eyebrow arched. She wasn't asking. She was setting up her next move. Then let me place some additional facts on the record. My citation, number 2024, T. 8847, involves a vehicle that was towed from the intersection in question. The towing company that responded to the scene was Prestige Auto Recovery. Are you familiar with that company, Your Honor? The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Hull said nothing. Let me help refresh your memory. Tanya pulled out yet another document. Her folder was like a magician's hat, producing exactly what was needed at exactly the right moment. Prestige Auto Recovery is a subsidiary of Hull and Associates Property Management, LLC, a company registered in 2019, a company in which you, Judge Marcus Hull, maintain a 37% ownership stake. Someone in the gallery gasped. The bailiff took a step backward, his hand moving away from Tanya and toward his radio instead. That's, Hull started, but Tanya was already continuing. The same Prestige Auto Recovery that has had contracts with the city since 2020 to handle all traffic enforcement towing in this district. The same company that charges a $320 base towing fee, plus $85 per day storage. The same company that, according to municipal records I've obtained through FOIA requests, has generated approximately $2.4 million in revenue over the past 4 years from vehicles towed, due to citations processed through this very courtroom. She paused, letting the numbers sink in. Your courtroom, Your Honor. Cases you've personally overseen. Citations you've personally upheld. Fines you've personally imposed, knowing that each one feeds money directly into a company you own. Hull was gripping the bench now, his knuckles white. I have no involvement in the day-to-day operations of Section 455.3 D. Doesn't require day-to-day involvement. Tanya interrupted, her voice sharp. It requires only a material financial interest, which, according to the LLC operating agreement I've attached as Exhibit C, entitles you to 37% of all net profits. Last year alone, that amounted to approximately $186,000 in distributions to you personally. The court reporter had started typing again, her fingers flying across the keys. This was history being made, and everyone in the room knew it. "How did you?" Hull's question died in his throat. He realized too late that he'd just confirmed the information was accurate. Tanya's expression didn't change. "How did I obtain sealed corporate documents?" "I didn't. They're not sealed. They're public record, filed with the Secretary of State's office. You just assumed no one would ever bother to look. That no one would think to cross-reference your personal financial holdings with municipal contracts. That no one would care enough to spend 6 years tracking every single case that flowed through your courtroom into your bank account." She took a step forward, and Hull actually flinched. "But I cared, Your Honor, because my citation isn't random. It isn't accidental. I specifically parked at that intersection on that day at that time, knowing exactly which officer would respond and which company would tow my vehicle. I manufactured this case. I designed it. And I walked into your courtroom this morning knowing exactly what you would do. Because men like you always do the same thing when you think someone is powerless." The gallery was in chaos now, whispers building to actual conversation. The bailiff was speaking into his radio, his voice urgent but unclear. Hull opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For the first time in 3 decades on the bench, Judge Marcus Hull had no idea what to say. Tanya picked up her recording device and held it up slightly. "This entire proceeding has been recorded. Every insult, every threat, every word. And pursuant to Section 455.3 d, subsection F, the moment I invoke judicial recusal due to undisclosed financial interest, this court lost its authority to proceed. Which means every action you've taken since I cited that statute, including your contempt finding, your threats about my law school career, and your order for my arrest, is legally void." She set the recorder back down with a soft click. "It also means, Your Honor, that you are no longer acting under qualified immunity. You are, as of this moment, a private citizen who just attempted to unlawfully imprison someone to protect your criminal enterprise." Hull's face was the color of ash. "You can't. I can. It is. And there's one more person I need to introduce to the court." Tanya turned and gestured toward the back of the courtroom, where a man in a gray suit had been sitting quietly the entire time. "That's Assistant State Attorney General Mitchell Crawford. He's been here since 9 a.m. He's witnessed everything. And he has a warrant." The man in the gray suit stood slowly, and the movement seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather credential holder, flipping it open to reveal a gold badge that caught the fluorescent light. "Mitchell Crawford, State Attorney General's Office, Public Integrity Unit." His voice was calm, almost bored, like he'd done this 100 times before. "Judge Hull, I'm going to need you to step down from the bench." For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The courtroom had become a photograph, frozen in the moment before everything shattered. Then Hull exploded. "This is insane." His voice cracked across the room like thunder, both hands slamming down on the bench. "This is a setup. Conspiracy. He jabbed a finger at Tanya. "You walked into my courtroom with the intention of framing me. This is entrapment." Tanya didn't flinch, didn't blink, just stood there with her hands resting on the podium, watching him unravel. "Assistant Attorney General Crawford." Hull's voice was climbing higher now, desperation bleeding through the rage. "This woman manufactured a false case for the purpose of targeting me specifically. That's prosecutorial misconduct. That's witness tampering. That's well within the bounds of investigative procedure," Crawford interrupted, pulling out a tablet and tapping it twice. "Ms. Morrison has been working as a confidential informant for my office for the past 18 months. Everything she's done has been under the supervision and approval of the Attorney General's Anti-Corruption Task Force." The gallery erupted. People were standing now, phones coming out despite the no-recording policy. Bailiff Morrison making no move to stop them because he just realized his boss was about to be arrested. Hull's face cycled through emotions so fast it was almost comical. Rage, confusion, terror, denial, back to rage. You can't do this. I'm a sitting judge. You need approval from the Judicial Ethics Commission. You need a grand jury indictment. We have both, Crawford said simply. The indictment was sealed pending today's confirmation of the evidence. Ms. Morrison's testimony and recordings will be Exhibit A through approximately Exhibit M. We have 16 witnesses prepared to testify about similar patterns of corruption and abuse of authority. We have forensic accountants who've traced money from Prestige Auto Recovery through shell companies and into your personal accounts. We have everything, Your Honor. Hull turned on Tanya, and the look in his eyes was pure venom. You lying little. Careful. Tanya's voice was soft, but it carried. That's being recorded too. And threatening a confidential informant during an active corruption investigation is a separate felony. Federal, actually. FBI gets involved at that point. Hull's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Let me explain what just happened here, Tanya continued, and her voice had taken on the patient tone of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. Hull's tone. She was using his own weapon against him. When you found me in contempt, you didn't just threaten my freedom. You attempted to silence an active witness in a state corruption case. That's obstruction of justice. When you threatened to have me expelled from law school, you were attempting to intimidate that same witness. That's witness tampering. When you ordered Officer Morrison to arrest me, knowing I was about to expose your financial crimes, you were attempting to use your judicial authority to cover up your own criminal enterprise. That's abuse of power under color of law. She picked up her folder and another document slid out. She'd prepared for everything. And because you did all of this after I invoked Section 455.3d, you were no longer acting as a judge with qualified immunity. You were acting as a private citizen attempting to kidnap another citizen to prevent the exposure of your crimes. In some jurisdictions, that would be considered attempted false imprisonment. In this jurisdiction, given the circumstances, the Attorney General's office is calling it attempted kidnapping.
No.
Hull was shaking his head, but the word came out weak. Broken. No, that's not. You can't twist the law like that. I am the law in this courtroom. I am. You were. Assistant Attorney General Crawford had moved closer now, standing near the bailiff. Officer Morrison, I'm going to need you to step aside. Judge Hull is about to be placed under arrest, and I need to make sure there's no conflict of interest given your employment relationship. Bailey Morrison didn't hesitate. He moved to the side of the courtroom, positioning himself near the door instead. The message was clear. He wasn't protecting Hull anymore. He was making sure Hull couldn't leave. Hull looked around the courtroom wildly, like he was searching for allies, for someone to back him up, to tell him this was all a mistake. But the gallery was full of people he'd humiliated, threatened, and destroyed over the years. The attorneys who'd learned to be afraid of him. The defendants who'd been crushed under his contempt orders. The court staff who'd witnessed his abuse and stayed silent out of fear for their jobs. Nobody was coming to help him. This is illegal, Hull said, but his voice had lost all its authority. He sounded like a child now, petulant, scared. You can't arrest a judge in his own courtroom. There are procedures. There are protocols. You have to. We followed every procedure, Crawford said. He gestured to two men in suits who'd apparently been waiting outside. They entered carrying additional recording equipment. And we've had audio and video surveillance running in this courtroom since 8 a.m. this morning. Courthouse security approved it. We have 3 separate recordings of everything you've said and done today. Hull's knees buckled. He caught himself on the bench, but barely. So to be clear, Your Honor, Tanya said, and there was no triumph in her voice, just cold, prosecutorial precision. Every threat you made, every insult you threw, every attempt to silence me, it's all evidence, all documented, all admissible. You didn't just commit crimes today. You performed them. For an audience. With multiple cameras rolling. She closed her folder with a soft snap. You wanted to teach me a lesson about respect. About power. About how the law really works. She looked directly at him, and for the first time she smiled. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was simply satisfied. Consider this my final exam. Tanya reached into her folder one more time, and what she pulled out wasn't a single document. It was a bound report, easily 50 pages thick, with tabs marking different sections. She set it on the podium with a heavy thunk that echoed through the silent courtroom. For the record, she said, addressing Crawford now instead of Hull. This is the complete financial analysis I've been compiling since March of 2023. It documents every case that passed through Judge Hull's courtroom where a vehicle was impounded by Prestige Auto Recovery. Every citation, every towing fee, every storage charge, and every single dollar that found its way back to Judge Hull's accounts. She flipped to a tab section marked in red. But the ownership stake in Prestige was just the foundation. The real money wasn't in the profit distributions. It was in what the Attorney General's office would call performance incentives. Hull had gone completely still. He wasn't arguing anymore. He was just staring at that report like it was a venomous snake coiled on the podium. Crawford moved closer, his expression sharpening with interest. Performance incentives? Direct kickbacks, Tanya clarified. For every case where Judge Hull upheld a citation that resulted in a Prestige tow, he received a payment of $500. Structured as consulting fees to a separate LLC he controls, Hull Advisory Services. The payments were always just under $10,000 per month to avoid bank reporting requirements. Over 4 years, that's approximately $438,000 in direct kickbacks, separate from his ownership distributions. She flipped to another section, this one marked with a yellow tab. The genius of the scheme was in how he structured the outcomes. Judge Hull didn't uphold every citation that came through his courtroom. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he maintained about a 73% uphold rate overall, right in line with county averages. But for cases involving Prestige Auto Recovery specifically, she looked up at Hull. 96%. The number hung in the air like an accusation. 96%, she repeated. Out of 847 cases over 4 years where Prestige was the towing company, Judge Hull ruled in favor of upholding the citation 813 times. He dismissed exactly 34 cases, and if you examine those dismissals, you'll find they were all situations where the citation was so legally indefensible that ruling otherwise would have triggered immediate appeals. Crawford was looking at his tablet now, presumably cross-referencing her numbers with his own investigation. He nodded slowly. This matches our forensic accounting. Tanya flipped to another section. But it gets worse. Judge Hull didn't just wait for Prestige cases to randomly appear on his docket. He actively manipulated the system to ensure they came to him. Municipal court assignments are supposed to be random, but if you examine the case distribution over the past 4 years, you'll find that Prestige-involved cases appeared on Judge Hull's docket at a rate 43% higher than statistical probability would suggest. That's impossible, someone in the gallery whispered. The computer assigns cases randomly, unless someone with administrative access adjusts the weighting algorithm, Tanya said without looking up from her report, which Judge Hull had, in his capacity as senior judge of the municipal district. Small changes. Nothing that would trigger an audit. Just enough to ensure a steady stream of revenue. She pulled out a flash drive from her folder and held it up. This contains copies of the modified case assignment code, retrieved from the court's server. It includes timestamps showing when the modifications were made and the administrator credentials used. All Judge Hull's. Hull made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. The scope of this operation is remarkable, Tanya continued, and her voice carried a cold admiration for the audacity of it all. Judge Hull created a perfect closed loop. He owned part of the towing company, He received kickbacks for cases involving that company. He manipulated case assignments to ensure more such cases appeared before him. And he used his judicial authority to crush anyone who questioned the system. She turned to a page near the back of the report. I spent 18 months building this case. I worked as a paralegal at 3 different law firms, specifically choosing firms that handle traffic cases in this district. I documented every pattern, every statistical anomaly, every suspicious ruling. I interviewed 42 defendants who'd been cited for violations involving prestige tows. I traced money through 4 different shell companies and 2 separate LLCs. Tanya's voice grew quieter, more personal, and I let myself fail the bar exam. Twice. On purpose. So I could remain a law student. So I could walk into this courtroom as someone Judge Hull would underestimate completely. Someone he'd see as weak, as clueless, as the perfect target for one more demonstration of his power. The courtroom was so silent that the hum of the fluorescent lights was audible. The traffic citation I received was real, she continued, but I chose when and where to get it. I researched patrol patterns and towing zones. I positioned my car in exactly the right spot at exactly the right time to ensure it would be prestige that responded. I even called the towing company myself afterward, asking questions designed to create a paper trail of their protocols. Every phone call was recorded. Every email was saved. Every receipt was cataloged. She looked directly at Hull now. You thought you were teaching me about power, about how the real world works, about respecting authority. But Your Honor, I've spent 6 years studying you. 6 years learning every detail of your operation. 6 years waiting for exactly the right moment to walk into your courtroom and let you destroy yourself. She closed the report with a decisive snap. The clueless law student? Tanya's smile was thin and sharp. She never existed. She was a character I created specifically for you. And you performed exactly as I knew you would. Because men who abuse power always make the same mistake. They assume that fear means stupidity. That silence means weakness. That submission means defeat. She handed the report to Crawford, who took it with something that might have been respect flickering across his professional expression. This is what real legal work looks like, Your Honor, Tanya said, turning back to Hull one final time. Not theatrics. Not intimidation. Just evidence, documentation, and patience. Hull opened his mouth, but no words came out. He'd finally run out of things to say. Hull tried one last time. His voice came out hoarse, desperate. Nothing like the commanding boom that had terrorized this courtroom for 3 decades. Officer Morrison, I am ordering you to remove this woman from my courtroom immediately. She is in contempt. She is. No, sir. Bailiff Morrison's response was quiet but absolute. He didn't move from his position by the door. I'm not doing that. The refusal hit Hull like a physical blow. His bailiff, his enforcement, the man who dragged dozens of people out of this courtroom on Hull's orders without question. Now standing there, arms crossed, shaking his head. I'm ordering you, Hull repeated, his voice climbing. As an officer of this court, you are required to. You're not a court anymore, Your Honor. Morrison's use of the title sounded almost apologetic. The Attorney General just said you lost immunity the second Ms. Morrison invoked that statute, which means you're not giving lawful orders. You're just asking me to help you commit a crime. Morrison glanced at Crawford, then back at Hull. And I've got 22 years until retirement. I'm not throwing that away for this. Hull turned to the court reporter, his desperation visible now in every movement. Janet, stop recording. Strike everything from the record after. Janet's hands lifted off the stenography machine. Not in compliance. In refusal. I can't do that, Judge Hull. She looked uncomfortable but determined. What Ms. Morrison cited, that statute about immunity, if what she's saying is true, then this proceeding stopped being official court business the moment she invoked it. which means I'm not taking orders from the bench anymore. I'm just documenting what's happening. Her fingers moved back to the machine, but not to delete anything. To continue recording. Hull stared at her like she'd just sprouted a second head. You work for me. Your salary is paid by this court. I work for the court system, Janet corrected gently. Not for you personally. And right now, the Attorney General is standing in this courtroom with an arrest warrant. So I think maybe I work for him. She kept typing. Hull spun toward the gallery, searching for support, for someone, anyone who would back him. The public defender who'd started to speak earlier was staring at his shoes. The attorneys waiting for their cases were either recording on their phones or furiously taking notes, already thinking about the clients they could help with this information, the appeals they could file, the cases they could reopen. The defendants in the gallery wore expressions ranging from shock to savage satisfaction. Nobody was on his side. The entire room had turned against him in the span of 10 minutes. This is insane, Hull said. But he was talking to himself now. This can't be happening. There are procedures. There are protections. I'm a judge. You were a judge, Tanya corrected. Not cruelly, just factually. The moment you attempted to jail me after I invoked judicial recusal, you stopped being a judge and became a defendant. The law is very clear about that. Section 455.3 d, subsection f. Any judicial officer who knowingly proceeds with official duties after proper invocation of recusal shall be deemed to have acted outside the scope of judicial authority. She recited it from memory. Perfect accuracy. No notes. You knew what you were doing, she continued. I cited the statute. I explained the conflict. I gave you every opportunity to recuse yourself, call a mistrial, and walk away. But you didn't. You threatened me. You mocked me. You ordered my arrest. And every single one of those actions happened after you lost your judicial immunity. Hull's legs gave out. He caught himself on his chair and slowly lowered himself into it. The throne that had made him powerful for 30 years now just looked like furniture. Just a chair behind a desk. Do you understand what just happened to you? Tanya asked, and there was something almost clinical in her tone. A surgeon explaining a diagnosis. Every case you've presided over in the past 4 years is now subject to appeal. Every defendant you sent to jail. Every fine you imposed. Every contempt charge you filed. Defense attorneys across 3 counties are going to be filing motions by tomorrow morning. Hundreds of cases. Maybe thousands. She let that sink in. Your legacy isn't going to be your convictions or your tough-on-crime reputation. Your legacy is going to be the chaos you've left behind. The innocent people you punished. The guilty people who go free because their convictions are tainted by your corruption. The complete loss of faith in this district's judicial system. Hull was staring at his hands now. They were shaking. And personally? Tanya's voice dropped lower. You're looking at federal corruption charges, state abuse of power charges, tax evasion for the unreported kickbacks, wire fraud for the electronic transfers, and potentially RICO charges if the Attorney General decides Prestige Auto Recovery qualifies as a criminal enterprise. The federal sentencing guidelines for judicial corruption start at 10 years. With the aggravating factors, the duration, the systematic nature, the number of victims, you're probably looking at 20 to 25. She paused, watching him process the numbers. You're 68 years old, Judge Hull. Even with good behavior, you'll die in prison. Hull made a sound like a wounded animal. His hands moved to cover his face. Crawford stepped forward, pulling handcuffs from his belt. 2 state troopers who'd been waiting outside entered the courtroom, flanking the door. Marcus Hull. Crawford's voice was formal now, official. I'm placing you under arrest for corruption of public office, abuse of authority under color of law, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. The Miranda rights echoed through the courtroom like a eulogy. Hull didn't resist when Crawford pulled his hands behind his back. Didn't protest when the cuffs clicked shut. He just sat there, broken, as the troopers lifted him to his feet and began walking him toward the door. As they passed the podium where Tanya stood, Hull looked at her one final time. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something. An apology, curse, a plea. But Tanya's expression stopped him. She wasn't gloating, wasn't celebrating. She just looked tired and sad and completely done with him. Hull said nothing. The troopers led him out through the same door he'd watched hundreds of defendants walk through in handcuffs. The courtroom remained silent long after he was gone. The sound of Hull's footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing fainter with each second. Metal handcuffs clicked against the door frame as the troopers maneuvered him through. The same handcuffs that were supposed to be biting into Tanya's wrists right now. The same walk of shame he'd orchestrated for countless others. The same humiliation he'd enjoyed inflicting. Nobody in the courtroom moved. It was like they were all waiting for confirmation that what they'd just witnessed was real. That the most powerful man in the district had actually just been arrested in his own courtroom by a third-year law student. Crawford broke the silence first. "Ms. Morrison, thank you for your testimony today. We'll need you to come down to the AG's office later this week to formalize everything for the grand jury. But for now," he gestured around the courtroom, "you're free to go. Free to go." Like she'd ever been in danger. Like she hadn't orchestrated every moment of this. Tanya nodded, gathering her documents back into her folder. Her hands were steady, but Crawford noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she closed the clasp. 6 years of preparation. 18 months of active investigation. 1 morning of performance. The adrenaline was finally catching up to her. "Ms. Morrison," the court reporter Janet spoke up tentatively. "Can I ask you something?" Tanya looked up. "Why?" Janet's eyes were red, like she was holding back tears. "Why go through all this? Why spend years of your life, risk your career, put yourself through all of this for a traffic ticket?" The courtroom waited for her answer. Even the attorneys who'd been preparing to leave had stopped, wanting to hear. Tanya was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than it had been all morning. More human. It wasn't about a traffic ticket. She pulled out one more document from her folder. Not evidence this time. A photograph. She held it up so Janet could see. A woman in her 40s, wearing courthouse security uniform, smiling at the camera. Her name was Rebecca Morrison. She worked as a clerk in this building for 12 years. "She was my mother." The silence deepened. In 2018, she discovered irregularities in case assignments. She brought them to her supervisor, who told her to drop it. She brought them to the Judicial Ethics Commission, who said they'd investigate and never did. And then she brought them to Judge Hull directly, thinking he'd want to know someone was tampering with his court systems. Tanya's voice didn't waver, but her eyes had gone distant, seeing something the rest of them couldn't. He fired her the next day, cited performance issues that had never existed before. She appealed, but Hull had friends in human resources, in the union, in every place that mattered. Within 6 months, she couldn't find work anywhere in the legal system. Within a year, we'd lost our house. Within 2 years, the stress had triggered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. She set the photograph down gently on the podium. She died 3 years ago, never got to see any kind of justice, never got her job back, never even got an apology. Tanya looked around the courtroom, meeting eyes with each person there. So no, this wasn't about a traffic ticket. This was about making sure no one else's mother gets destroyed for trying to do the right thing. Janet was crying openly now. Several people in the gallery were wiping their eyes. Tanya picked up her folder and walked toward the gallery. But as she passed the bench, Crawford called out, "Ms. Morrison? One more thing." She turned. Crawford had a slight smile on his face. "The Attorney General wants you to know that your law school has been contacted. They're aware of your work with our office. and they've been informed that your bar exam scores, the real ones, were actually among the highest in your class. Both times. Tanya's composure finally cracked. Just for a second. Just enough to show that beneath the prosecutor, beneath the investigator, beneath the woman who'd just taken down a corrupt judge, there was still a law student who'd sacrificed years of her life for this moment. You're taking the bar again next month, Crawford continued. And this time you're going to pass it. For real. And when you do, I'm told there's a position waiting for you at the Public Integrity Unit. If you want it. I want it, Tanya said without hesitation. Crawford nodded. Good. We need people like you. He left then, taking his troopers with him, leaving Tanya standing in the aisle of the courtroom. The gallery began to empty slowly. People filed past her, and some of them, the defendants who'd been humiliated, the attorneys who'd been silenced, the court staff who'd witnessed years of abuse, stopped to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her they'd wished they'd been brave enough to do what she did. When the courtroom was nearly empty, Tanya walked back toward the front. She climbed the 2 steps up to the bench, something defendants were never allowed to do, and stood where Hull had stood, where he'd looked down on hundreds of people and made them feel small. From up here, the courtroom looked different. The gallery seemed smaller, the podium less intimidating. The whole space felt like what it was supposed to be, a place where justice happened. Not a throne room, not a kingdom, just a courtroom. She touched the desk where Hull had slammed his gavel so many times in anger, ran her fingers over the smooth wood worn down by decades of use and abuse. This is for you, Mom, she whispered to the empty room. Then Tanya Morrison, third-year law student, confidential informant, and the woman who'd just dismantled a 30-year criminal enterprise with nothing but patience and evidence, walked out of courtroom 4B with her head high and her folder tucked under her arm. The handcuffs that were meant for her remained in Officer Morrison's belt. And Judge Marcus Hull's chair sat empty behind the bench, waiting for someone worthy to fill it. Justice, it turned out, didn't always look like a gavel coming down. Sometimes it looked like a young woman who refused to stay silent. Sometimes it looked like revenge served cold after 6 years of preparation. And sometimes, just sometimes, it looked exactly like it was supposed to. Tanya didn't just win a case. She started a revolution in that courtroom. We have more stories coming up this week. You won't want to miss the next one. Subscribe and join the family so you're the first to know when it drops. Before you go, drop a justice in the comments if you stayed until the very end. I'll be hearting all responses.